Hello, and welcome back to the Intuition Experiment. I am Julie, and I'm here with the second part, the second installment of my speaking my truth, of my telling my story. Full disclosure, your girl has been emotional. I'm like triggering myself, and so, I am going to once again extend a trigger warning to anyone who is sensitive to topics of domestic violence, of suicidal thoughts, of mental illness, of you. I'm trying to think. Have I covered all the bases? If trauma, people experiencing trauma and great distress in their lives is very triggering to you at this moment, I would suggest that you do not tune into this video. For those who are going to stick around, I had left off my last video and I had just started high school. Oh, my little heart is beating so hard. Like, speaking on all of this is really quite a challenge for me, but here I am. Doing my best to relay my story in the hopes that this is the healing that is required to help me move forward. And so I had started high school and I was there a very brief time, a week, 2 weeks, I'm not sure. In terms of timing of things, like I had said in a previous video, there are big lapses in memory and I have vague recollections of some events. So a week, 2 weeks maybe go by, I'm not sure. But one afternoon in high school, I was called to the principal's office and I had no idea what was going on. My mother was sitting in the principal's office and I was told to go collect all of my belongings from my locker and that I was leaving the school. And this was all news to me. Behind the scenes, I hadn't realized that an elderly couple who had ran a store in the small town that we grew up around had befriended my mother. And to the best of my knowledge, she had started confiding the degree of toxicity within our household to them. And she was started to tell her story to them and look for comfort or friendship with this couple. And so it was the men in the couple whose pickup truck was waiting outside of our house with stuff packed up into the back, and we were told that we were never coming back. And so I left my high school that day, I left my house that day, and we were brought to a woman's shelter that I have vague recollections of, like the smell and the feel and the darkness. As an empath that I know I am now, it's perhaps that I was tuning into the sorrows that had stayed stagnant in that space. But I hadn't realized as well, and how could I have, that my mother had been in contact with a long estranged brother of hers, a brother who had run away at a young age, moved across the country to British Columbia and started off his life again, married, had children, was a born-again Christian, very active in a church. She had been in contact with him and confided in him what was going on as well. And so, unbeknownst to us as children, he had bought tickets for us to go fly to British Columbia and start our lives again out there. But in the interim, we needed to get out of our house. We're in a woman's shelter. My grandparents are going crazy trying to find us and circling the block. And my mom did not feel safe, I suppose. And I don't remember this part, but she said that one night we snuck out of the back of the woman's shelter through bushes. And again, the man in the elderly couple was waiting for us to take us to his son's house. His son who was divorced, his son who had 2 children that did not live with him, who had this big farmhouse and space for us to stay. And so we showed up late one evening at this man's house, and my mom went inside to speak with him, and we stayed outside. And that is a place that we stayed at for not maybe a week. I'm not sure. I'm not sure really, until it was time for us to get on a flight and go out west. But the thing is that behind the scenes also, I didn't realize that she had begun very quickly developing a relationship with this man. Things were getting romantic. And the tickets to go out west, my brother, who was closest in age to myself, and I had tickets on a separate flight than my mother did. And so we were put on a plane to go to Vancouver to meet an uncle that I had never really even heard talk of before, with the promise that my mom would follow shortly after. Again, I don't remember very much, but it does make me pretty sad thinking about it, because I can flash back to the energy and the sadness and the feeling of disruption and despair. Also, remembering how my mom was supposed to join us and she had missed her flight. And she didn't show up when she was supposed to show up. And that was a very hard blow and a feeling of abandonment. And I remember having the thought that it was intentional, that she was leaving us with these strangers, a whole family of strangers, to stay with this man that she had just met. She did eventually make her way out to British Columbia. And while we lived in Abbotsford, British Columbia, it was less than a year. I did my grade 7 schooling in British Columbia. There was a big disconnect, I believe, but I have no idea what was going on behind the scenes. But between between my mother and her brother, that situation did not last long. That situation ended up in my hearing my mom cry some nights, her putting us to bed, and we were staying in the basement of my uncle's house. And I can't imagine what she was going through at the time. At the same time, not feeling seen or heard or cared for or fitting in at school. There were it was a rough time. That lasted less than a year, and the man whose house we had stayed in, the man whose house we had found shelter in for that week or 2 weeks or whatever that was, my mom's new romantic interest, ended up getting what are those cars? The long cars with the back door. You could sit facing back. A station wagon with the wood paneling, the whole jazz. He ended up driving from Quebec all the way across the country and picking us up under a year that we had been in British Columbia. And collectively, the 4 kids and this new couple drove all the way back across Canada and showed up back at that farmhouse. And so things seem to the best of my knowledge, settle down somewhat, because this man was not violent. He was not a screamer. Things were not, it didn't feel dangerous, but I felt replaced in the way of wanting time with my mother and developing stability outside of this new relationship that took all of her attention. And he did have 2 children, and I felt that in the hierarchy of who my mother cared for, that it would always be whatever man she was with, followed by his children, followed by her children. I remember that there was, it sounds so small, but it's just like, it leaves a big scar. There was this Christmas that my mom is an avid knitter. She loves to knit. And not that I really wanted a knit sweater, but she was knitting sweaters. And I said, please, I want a sweater like that. Make me this sweater because I knew she was making it for my stepsister. And I never got the sweater. My stepsister did. It's a weird example, I suppose, of all these things that I used very early on to confirm that I was not a priority. And so by the time I was entering grade 10, I was back. We were in contact with my grandparents, some contact with my father here and there, but I had reached a point where I felt like I wanted to leave my mother's and my stepfather's house and go somewhere, go live again beside my grandparents where I would be doted on and felt cared for and felt seen and put in first place. This being said, I had signed up to go back and live with my father who had remarried, my father who had a new baby with his second wife. My hearing from my grandmother, this is something that I've heard a fair amount of times. This story about how your father's changed and he's a new man, and the only beer your father drinks now is root beer. Like that line. And I really, really, really wanted to believe that that was true. And so I picked up and I left my mom's house and I went to live with my father. And that lasted for 1 year because as anyone listening to this right now could imagine, things were exactly as we had left them when I was a kid. I remember how dangerous it felt, how volatile, the alcoholism, the abuse. I remember an incident where it was maybe 2 o'clock in the morning and I was awake because my father was on top of my stepmother and just screaming and pounding on her. And I did not know what to do. And it was like I reverted back to being that small, scared child. And I'm like 15 maybe at the time. And so I remember calling my best friend at the time and whispering and crying and saying, like, I'm so scared and I don't know what to do. I lasted that 1 year, grade 10. Then I went back and I talked to my mom and I said, listen, things are really bad. Like, they're really bad and I need to come back. And so I did. I left my father's house. I went back to live with my mom. I finished my high school while living at my mom's. And it was around the time that I was 16, probably, that it was very clear that my mental health was deteriorating. Despite having pursued therapy, and there had been through the years some family therapy that we had pursued, some one-on-one. I was like not doing okay, and so I was brought to my family doctor and diagnosed with depression and started antidepressants. It was after I finished high school that I moved out with my first boyfriend. And young and fresh in the world, thinking I was grown, not really knowing what to expect. The fact that I was kind of like by myself for the first time, but by myself with, I don't know, the burden of all of this past trauma that I did not know how to unpack. My mental health very much deteriorated to the point that I developed such insecurity about myself and anxiety that if I would go out in public, I was convinced that everyone was talking about me, that anyone who would laugh, it was a laugh, that it pointed in my direction, that they were laughing at how ugly or how fat I was. And so I stayed locked away in that new apartment for almost a year, I'd say, until finally I ventured out and I got a job nearby at Zellers. And I started actively setting fire to the relationship with my boyfriend in being a terribly dishonest, inconsiderate, unloving partner. Things started to deteriorate there. And over the course of a couple years, I ended up separating from him, taking my own apartment, and I discovered, after our scene, I had discovered earlier on, probably by the time I was 15, I had started drinking. By the time I was 15, I'd lost my virginity. In grade 11, my last year of high school, I was already experimenting with hard drugs. Ecstasy was like the big thing at the time. And so by the time I was about 19, fresh on the scene of this hardcore party culture and hard drug culture, my life as I had known it took a massive turn. And that's going to be a chapter for another day. But as I've done in the last video, I'm just going to take a moment to say, God, my spirit guides, the angels who love and support me, to my ancestors who have journeyed with me in the highest and greatest good for all and causing harm to none, I release these issues to you. I release the burden of this story and the weight of all of my sadness. I give it to you because it's too much for me to carry. And so I release this now. And to anyone who has tuned in, it is greatly appreciated that you're here to hear me out because I need it. And so I am sure to follow up again because this story does not end there in the least. But here is second installment of my Speaking My Truth. I will catch you in another one.